small group of Georgians swarmed a captured cannon after a short, decisive charge against Union troops along rock-strewn Houck's Ridge during the afternoon of July 2nd. The gun, a 10-pounder Parrott, now belonged to them. One of the soldiers, First Lieutenant Pinckney Gilliard Hatchett, basked in the glory of victory. Thrilled with success after a heart-pounding, adrenaline-pumping scramble uphill against a hail of shot and shell, he assumed the day was won. His day, however, had only just begun. This is his Gettysburg story.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. These fields are filled with stories. From the big units and the fights and the battles that happen out here, the death and destruction, everything, including the individual story of the soldiers that fought here and the civilians that suffered through the aftermath and the months of the stench of the dead. But today we're out here to tell a story about one of those soldiers that fought out here for the Confederate Army, the 20th Georgia. Is it any wonder that people leave items like this behind me here? It's a wreath for the 124th New York at the statue here just in front of the triangular field. Devil's Den is over here to my left-hand side. People come out here all the time and leave flowers, flags, coins, wreaths, various different things to show their respects to the men that fought out here, to the men that they don't even know. The reason behind it is because they have a personal connection somewhere deep down inside of them. The majority of the people that do that, they have ancestry that fought out here. And it's really no different in any other battlefield, but at this place, the connection seems to be just a little bit stronger. And maybe it's because of the drama that happened out here and unfolded on those 3 hot days in July. I'm in the shadows of the 124th New York right now to tell a story about a man named Pinky. Or at least that's what his nickname was back home in Georgia. Now Pinky grew up in Georgia, and he probably never thought he'd ever see the Rocky Hills of a place like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In those days, world traveler meant that if you lived in Columbus, somehow you got to Atlanta. Now you were an official world traveler. You went to the big city. Well, Pinky ends up here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he gets in over his head real fast out here near Houck's Ridge and the triangular field. Now, he's no rookie when it comes to fighting. In 1861, he ends up leaving his town and joining the army for the Confederacy. He enlists and ends up leading Company E in the 20th Georgia. He ends up fighting in places such as Antietam. So he's been involved in some massive fights leading up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And sometimes, when the momentum is right, the battle turns and it changes. And a lot of these young leaders see that to mean that they're winning the fight, and they push their men as far as they can. Well, he got himself out here, and got himself into a little bit of trouble because he used that emotion while he was fighting here at Gettysburg. Now to give you a little bit of orientation where we're at right now. Coming back around in this direction here, you can clearly see the rocks down below there. That's Devil's Den. Off behind the cannons in the distance, that's the little round top. The slaughter pen lays down below in the middle of all of that. And down below through here. Off in the distance over there, beyond that tree line, that's where the Confederate soldiers are coming from. And as they come through here, in this position of the talk that we're having today, we're talking about the 2nd Georgia, the 17th Georgia, the 20th Georgia, and the 15th Georgia of Bennings, as they're coming up through these fields. Right off out in that area over there, this area out in here, is that field known as a triangular field, or at least that's the beginning of it. The 20th is actually pushing up through that area and end up on the ridge line close to Houck's Ridge and out here at the rocky outcropping. So the men are kind of spread out all over when they come up through here. Hatchett across these fields over here. He's dressed his men off. He's gotten his marching orders, and he's getting them from Benning. Benning, after the war, admittedly said that he got his orders confused. He wasn't supposed to really be where he was at, but he ends up over here in this fight. Well, Hatchett is a little confused too. He gets his dander up. He's got his men fighting with him. And he's going across these fields, and things are seeming to be a little too easy. His company is charging with him. And as they go up across these rocky heights, he can see the enemy's cannon off in the distance. That becomes a target real quick. So they start to make their way towards that cannon. And off in the distance behind me, they had to traverse that field up in that area towards the rocky heights. Benning and his men are making pretty good work, pretty good progress out here. Hatchett, on the other hand, gets out ahead of the rest of the 20th and ends up coming across this field with his men. He gets up to the top of the rocky heights and then looks back. And he's right next to a boulder, much like the one right behind me here. It's not very large, but he gets on top of that boulder, egging his men on, and looks back at this position here and realizes he's a long way away from the main lines. They've been told to halt back down there. They have a position to fall back to where they're covering it. His men, however, are way up here. So to give you a reference point for how far away he is, Hatchett is where I'm at right now. And the rest of the men are back down there towards where that boulder is. And they're kind of lined up behind some rocks, halted, reforming, and trying to come up here in concentration towards the position. Hatchett's made a very big mistake, because as soon as he gets up to this ridge line, off to the distance over here, the Union soldiers have lined up and they're starting to fire in his direction. And now he's taking enfilade fire right down the line of the men that he has here with him. And there's not very many in his group. Hatchett, sitting up on top of this boulder, realizes he has a big problem on his hands. Him and the handful of soldiers that are still with him, because the rest of them retreat back down the hill like smart individuals. Him and the rest of those soldiers slide down the side of the big boulder, like the one I'm standing on now. And as they get down there, Hatchett realizes there's not a lot of cover here. You can't stand upright. You're going to take a bullet to the head. So several of them crouch down behind this boulder, and they get into hiding position as best they can. They're not very well covered on either side. The Union's firing at them from all sides. Hatchett's legs sticking out, and he takes a bullet to the foot, right there near the ankle. He can't come across this field. So now, with the rest of his men who have hightailed it back across to safety, they've left him out here. Hatchett's got to figure out what he's going to do from this point. Now, reenactors know what I'm talking about when I say you don't see very much when you're in the line of fire. Meaning that when the soldiers are lined up together and formed up for their fight, even if it's a pretend fight, they stick to the man to the left and to the right. And the officer that's in charge out front has to pay attention to the orders that are being given, the bugle calls, and the positions in front. And depending on how far up in rank they are concerned about only one thing, which is keeping the line straight and going in the direction that they've been told to go. Keeping people in order. Well, they're probably not looking far off into the distance to see the little round top is covered with soldiers. Hatchett records that when he got up here to the top where he was at, in that boulder, he looked up and he could see Union troops swarming Little Round Top. And he didn't think that there were soldiers up there. So now he realizes he could be shot at from way up there on Little Round Top too. So he devises a plan to crawl back to the main lines that he was once at. And he's crawling across this field for dear life. And somehow he manages to make it back to the 20th Georgia. Hatchett would go on to live past this battle, and he would muster out in 1864. Hatchett's fiery rebel spirit isn't over with here at Gettysburg. And it doesn't end in 1864 either. He musters out of that army, makes his way back to home, and ends up in Texas. Ironically, he doesn't take that oath of allegiance until 1871. Meaning, he still considers himself a rebel right up until that point. He hasn't ceded the victory to the North just yet. But when he gets to Texas, he ends up becoming a school teacher at one point in time. He sold kerosene. He had a cattle business. And he would die in 1931 at the age of 92. He had a wife and 2 sons that survived him. His friends called him a rough old man. The ones that knew him the best. And he had a story here at Gettysburg to tell. And that's why we decided to tell it today. It was the tenacity and the fighting spirit of the men that came up on these fields and thought that they could take these rocks, that pushed the Union soldiers back as far as they did, that made this position look like it was going to fail. But on the flip side of that coin, it was the fighting spirit of those Union soldiers up here and their leadership that kept them in place. Forced a conclusion to Gettysburg, and ultimately a conclusion to the Civil War, where the United States would be victorious and the Union would survive. Well, as I stand out here looking across the fields where Pickett's charge once took place, I'm grateful that I'm out here to be able to tell these stories to you and be able to take the time to bring you to these places. I really hope you enjoy the story of Lieutenant Hatchett out there on Houck's Ridge and Devil's Den. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.
Hatchett served with the 20th Georgia until the autumn of 1864, which was the last time he was listed on the regimental rolls. At some point, he settled in Texas and avoided signing the oath of allegiance to the federal government until 1871. Most Confederate soldiers had signed within days and weeks of the surrender of the armies and collapse of the Confederate government. Hatchett taught school for a time, started a short-lived cattle business, and even sold kerosene. He lived until age 92, dying in 1931. He would often tell his story, his Gettysburg story, until the end. His wife and 2 sons survived him.